Good afternoon. Welcome to the Business Boardcast. I'm Nikki Larkin. I'm hosting today. I'm delighted that I have Bryn Wilkinson with me today from Peninsula. He has Peninsula just above him in case you forget. And we're talking about a subject that a lot of people are worried and apprehensive about, which is redundancies. So for leaders out there, we wanted to go through sort of the basics of redundancies, why you should use them or options for not using them, but to give you a bit more confidence and detail about them so that as the changing conditions come up, you feel more confident into being able to use this and having this as in your toolkit for options for you. So Bryn has worked with Peninsula for 16 years. I can't believe it.
16.
And it's interesting because Gorringe have worked with Peninsula since we started, which was 15 years ago. So so we've had a long relationship with Bryn. So thank you very much, Bryn. So just for the viewers, just tell us a bit sort of what is your day-to-day role in Peninsula.
Absolutely. So my day-to-day role is giving advice and helping our clients deal with their day-to-day issues with staff. So whether it's lateness, absences kind of issues, maybe someone's pregnant and you need to manage that situation, maybe someone's gone off long-term sick, but also obviously these situations like redundancies and settlements, etc. So I worked on the redundancy team for a number of years. So hopefully I've got quite a lot of experience that I can give today on this meeting.
Indeed, I'm sure like lots and lots, so be super helpful. So so in case you haven't watched the Business Boardcast before, you're watching live at the moment, whether it's on LinkedIn or YouTube, please do say hello in the comments. Please do feel free to ask questions. I know that it might be a bit sensitive in this area, so do put it in there that you're asking on behalf of clients, or it's a general question, or whatever else. We're not outing you that your organisation's looking at redundancies. But also, I will give you some contact details at the end, so that if you want a more confidential discussion with one of the advisors, that we can put you in touch. Make sure you have a free confidential chat. But as I said, do put up questions, any general questions. I know some of my team will be watching, which are not risk of redundancy because we're recruiting, not making recruitment. So please, if they can put up questions. So why are redundancies a hot topic at the moment? Because we're seeing it a lot in the press, but what are the main things why they're such a hot topic?
So obviously redundancies have obviously been a hot topic for probably a couple of years now, since obviously the back of Brexit, and then we had COVID. So a lot of companies had no choice but to make redundancies. What we found, it's plateaued somewhat, and it actually went down towards the end of last year. But again, this year it looks like it's re-emerging again. There's a number of different factors. We're looking at, the cost of living is a big impact, and that obviously is the cost of the materials, etc., and the things that businesses need. Overheads effectively are going up. When we look at things like petrol prices as well, it's gas and electricity prices. There's a lot of interest rates as well. There's many different factors that are all coming together to make a bit of a perfect storm, and companies are having to assess how they are structured and think of ways to try and save some money to keep afloat. So redundancies, they do get a bad name. Obviously, as soon as you hear the word redundancy, it can strike fear into employers and employees, of course. But sometimes it's a necessary situation, because ultimately making redundancies could save a lot more jobs in the future, and basically maybe taking a bit of a step back, so you're able to move forward then
And of course, it's not just a tool for businesses that are experiencing difficult trading conditions. It could be because of natural restructures as different divisions are in the end of their growth cycle, and they've got other divisions that are growing. So, I mean, when I was in tech, we would have regular ads of redundancies, and often it was because certain tech was out of fashion, other was around. So they had to juggle them around, and they used redundancies as part of their process for that, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. That's quite a big one. So it's not, you don't always have to be evidencing that you're losing money or that you might go bankrupt. It could be that we're streamlining it so that the business is more flexible and moving forwards in case there is any issues like we're seeing at the moment with market issues. But yeah, it might be, it certainly is technical points. We see it a lot, particularly maybe in like manufacturing where there's new machinery or new software that means that takes a bit of time away, more efficient, and ultimately that might mean that people aren't needed to fill certain roles. So yeah, there's a whole different host of reasons why you might look at it.
The other thing that's coming out from Brexit or from COVID as well is relocation. So as people are now working more and more from home, why do they need to necessarily run expensive offices perhaps in the south, and might moving up to Manchester near to you, or might even be offshoring. So there's lots of different reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that your overall head count's going to decrease. It could just be the particular roles in certain areas are going to decrease, and you could be increasing in other areas to compensate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get the technical bit out of the way. What is the actual definition of redundancy?
Okay, yeah. So the definition is when there's a reduction or cessation of work or a particular role. Okay, and that also includes the location. So there has to be a reduction in work or a reduction in the need for a role or a complete cessation. So that's how you would describe what redundancy is. People often say, I'm going to let someone go, I'm going to make someone redundant, when actually there isn't a reduction in work, and it might be other factors that are more at play. Maybe it's the capability or the behaviour, etc., that might be more of an issue. So it's really important that to note that it's got to be a reduction or a cessation of the work. It's not any of the other 4 other reasons you can dismiss somebody, because redundancy is one of the 5 fair reasons to dismiss somebody. Your other reasons are quite clear. You've got your conduct, your capability, obviously redundancy being a main one, and there might be a statutory ban reason. There might be somebody who is banned from working in a particular sector, or there might be a bit of a catch-all, what we call some other significant reasons, so breakdown of trust and relationship, etc. But redundancy is its own defined fair reason for dismissing an employee. Yeah.
Okay. So before we go too much into detail of redundancy, what are the other options that we could be looking at?
Okay,
because
so
no one really wants to do redundancies if they can help it. So what sort of things could we have been going through before we get to the point that we're actually going to do a redundancy round?
So bearing in mind, redundancies are, it's not an ideal situation to be in, because the impact it has on staff morale as well. What is the way to look at redundancy? It's a last resort situation. So we'll have to look at ways in which we can try and avoid even starting a redundancy process. And actually, this is what's required if you end up having to start making people redundant. You have to create a business case, and within that business case, you talk about the things that you've already explored and looked at. So when we look at the alternatives, we can look at potentially, have you got some training scheduled, external training? Is it overtime being paid? Have we got people on discretionary bonuses that we can pause? It could be that you've got to bear in mind, if you've got new recruitment people coming in the business, is that actually needed if we're losing people? Bearing in mind that the idea is to try and keep the staff that are currently there, not bring in new people. It could be that we try and find other ways to cut costs. Do we increase the price of your products or services? Bearing in mind, is that going to make you too expensive compared to the market? So you've got to look at the overall pictures. But there's loads of different ways we can look to try and cost cut effectively. Often these are things that are already being considered at the point that you think, right, we need to make redundancies, but it's all about evidencing that you have considered those things and writing those down as part of your business case. So there's those things initially. What we could also look at is if it's only going to be a temporary or a short time reduction in work, for example, do we actually need to make people redundant? Can we utilize there's a clause you can put into your handbook. It's called a short-time working clause, and there's also a layoff clause. These are temporary things, so you can put somebody on temporary reduced hours. So if there's a reduction in work, we can reduce their hours on a temporary basis, or give them no hours on a temporary basis. There is rules around that, of course. So the word temporary is key there. We can't put somebody on a quarter of their hours for the next 6 months, or give them no work for 3 or 4 months on the trot. It's got to be the way in which the rules work is that if you reduce their hours by more than 50%, and that's been going on for over 2 months, then they've got the right to claim for redundancy pay at that point. So and same with the layoff. If you've been completely laid off as well, they can ask for redundancy. It's usually after a month, but within the second month, you can give them the work back, and you can avoid having to do that. But layoff and short time working is, if you've got the contractual right to do it, you might be able to ride through any particularly difficult times if it's a reduction in work. However, it still might end up having to make redundancies. It's also worth noting, if you don't have that clause and you go ahead and make those reductions in people's hours and ultimately their pay, they can resign and claim constructive dismissal, because you don't have the right to be able to do that. So it's really key that you've got that in there. To give you an example of when you would use that, so it's, for example, during the COVID situation was a perfect time for people to use the temporary layoff. So when business had to close maybe for a month or two at a time, they could, rather than make everyone redundant and paying out £1,000 of redundancy only to recruit people back in again, and training costs, etc., and recruitment costs, you can utilize those short time working, those layoff situations. So it's a good little but there's also other ways. So can we look at their what pay they're currently getting, what bonuses. So there's loads of different ways to try and avoid redundancy in the first instance. And like I said, all these has to go into writing your business case. If you eventually have to go and press the button to start the process, then it has to be written down anyway. So
yeah, and I've had to write quite a few of those before, which is never a very fun thing to do. But you have to remember, you're doing roles, not people, so you're using very fair metrics.
That's key.
Very fair metrics.
The roles, not people, is one of the main things that we really try and state this, because if we're looking at making people redundant, that's where you can get your discrimination claims, and if making a role redundant, it just so happens that someone's within that role. So we try and keep it as objective rather than subjective as possible, these processes. But it's a good point you raised.
But you do have flexibility on the criteria that you're using, because it's dependent upon your business. So you, as the business owner, or the manager, know what are the key things that you need for your business to be successful going forward. And so that's why you can choose the criteria, as long as they are not discriminatory criteria, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that brings me on to a couple of other things that you can look at. Is you hear a lot of time last in, first out. Now, it is unlawful, but it can be possible in certain situations. What we have to look at in those situations, if that person who is last, let's just say it was a team of 5 people and you need to lose 1. If that person who was last in maybe holds a protected characteristic, and maybe there's a potential risk of discrimination, whether they might be younger than everyone else, which is usually often the case for that it might be that they've got a disability, or the different religious beliefs. So there's about 9 different protected characteristics. So if that person holds one of those, then last in, first out could end up coming back to bite you, because they can raise those claims. So you may still have to do a full process. But if there isn't necessarily any discrimination elements, then we may be able just to do a short service redundancy. So just focus on those under 2 years service. What I'd say is it's very much case by case basis. So what we don't want people to do is just say last in, first out, let's just do it, and we need to just pick the last 3 in and off they go. It could be more issues than that.
But things that you can look at voluntary redundancy as well. But you've just got to be careful that your best people.
Yeah, your best people might want to go, or those who've been there for 30 years are going to get a nice payment.
That'd be expensive. But you've got to think what's best for your business. So it could be things like comparing of the most billable people, the most who the measurements that they had in their last appraisal. Different things like that can be utilized because those are fair comparisons.
Absolutely. And the final option to take to avoid redundancy is if you've got someone in mind in particular, rather than just telling them we're making you redundant, which obviously can bring a lot of risks, you could look to enter a without prejudice discussion, effectively offer a settlement agreement to that individual. You probably end up paying more than what they would get if you went through a process, but because there's usually a little bit of an added extra to make them want to sign the agreement. But what that can do is it can avoid bringing maybe a team of people through a 2-3 week process that can really impact the staff morale. And obviously the time,
that's the downside I've seen is you have the really good people, even that those really good people, you can't say to them, oh, don't worry, it's okay, because you've got to treat them all fairly and be part of that process if they fit into the criteria.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the other thing, so that is a really good process doing that. Sorry, I've forgotten what you call that what you just called that.
Well, without prejudice,
without prejudice discussions. But also, some people, utilize the redundancies as a shortcut instead of having the difficult conversations. And you just need, as leaders, you need to get trained and have the backup from your HR department or your advisors. If you've got a poor performer, you need to have your processes in place to either improve them using PIPs or get rid of them, but in the right way. And sometimes I've seen people snuck in thinking, oh, they just don't want the headache of sacking person. They think it's a nicer thing to make them, and it's just like, yeah, it might be for that individual perhaps a bit nicer to be able to say I was made redundant instead of sacked, but it's not fair for the wider group.
Yeah. And ultimately what can also happen is that if it's what's called a sham redundancy, i.e. there wasn't a reduction in work or there was cessation of work, not only they're going to be able to bring an unfair dismissal claim and often try and attach some form of discrimination issue, which one of the cases I'm going to touch on today was exactly that happens. So sometimes you think you're being nice by doing it as a business leader, but actually you can end up causing yourself a lot more issues down the line. So, yeah.
Indeed. So you're saying about cases there. So this is exactly the right time. So how can it go wrong? Give me some examples of nasty situations.
Well, you've probably all heard about this one. P&O cruise ferries, should I say? That was really was front page news. So they effectively they didn't go through any process whatsoever. So if there's one thing to know out of here is that to make someone redundant, the process is key. Really, you might have a fundamental business reason to have to make the redundancies, but if you don't do the process in the right way, you can still get stung with unfair dismissal claims because those claims are based on the process itself and whether or not it was a legitimate redundancy. So you might tick one box, but you've got a big cross next to the process box. So, and we've seen that a lot, unfortunately, over COVID. A lot of companies had to do very quick knee-jerk reactions and didn't follow any process, and now they're obviously feeling the pain from tribunal claims now on the back of it. But P&O Ferries did exactly that. They just basically had a phone call. It was a pre-recorded video call, actually. It wasn't even individual consultation. They just basically told these 800 people that they'll be made redundant with immediate effect. So no consultation was followed at all.
Some of those people had worked there for decades.
Absolutely, yeah. It was, which is why what you've got to consider is, yes, you've got the tribunal claims, but it's also the reputational damage, because this goes for any company. If you're making people redundant, you want to do it in a fair and reasonable way. So then there's no comeback, because it's an emotive subject. It really is. So if people are losing their jobs and the impact on their ability to put food on the table, and you've not done a proper process, it can come back to really haunt the company in terms of that reputational damage. And obviously we've seen it with P&O Ferries. I think shortly after that all broke out, they were up against the wall, because no one was using the ferries after that. No one wanted to be associated with them. Just so happened, just to give you an outline of that one, they managed to settle pretty much all of those claims. So they're not going to be going to court now, because they're going to pay them out under these settlement agreements. I think there's just one person who's refused, who's going to take it, and take it all the way. Yeah, taking it all the way. So they're gonna we'll find out, usually probably in 2 or 3 years' time, how.
But that's the thing. A lot of people in that instance weren't particularly well paid anyway. So if you're faced with, well, can I do a settlement now or go through the court process? So the majority of people are going to say, oh no, I'd rather have my jam today than jam tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's very sad. Very sad.
Also, what you've got to also remember is it wasn't a redundancy situation, because there wasn't any reduction in work. The work was still there. They just couldn't afford the staff. So even the reason for the dismissal was unfair. So that's a really obvious example. But just to touch on another case, which is more obviously low level than P&O. So this is a garage, effectively, and a member of staff there. He was 68. He was the oldest there by a long shot. And what the company did there is, because of issues with their capability to do the job, rather than go through rather than manage that through the right way, as you mentioned, capability process, put a PIP in place and manage that. Maybe even suggest a settlement if that process is going to be too arduous and long-winded for them. And what they decided to do is just they held a meeting which lasted 13 minutes with just that one person, and dismissed him. Now, he was part of a team of several people who did the same job. So you got a pool of people. You just pick someone. It just so happens that person was the oldest. He had a bit of a nickname as well. He was called Half Dead Dave as well, because of his age. So because of that, he also lodged discrimination as well as unfair dismissal. And as you can imagine, he won the claim. 25 grand he got for that. So yeah, there's aggravating factors often that can be attached to these kind of claims. So again, process is key. What should have happened there is pooled in the group, do the scoring, which we'll go into detail shortly about the actual process. But then they wouldn't have had to face that claim.
So exactly that now. So we haven't got time to go through the full process in detail. As I said, I will be putting people in touch with people with actually your colleague Owen, who is often on our calls with us.
Yep.
So that people can go into more detail. But so we've only got about 5 minutes left. So just give us the overview of how do we start the process in a legal fashion.
Yep. Appreciate that. So as I touched on before, business case is a key document. So if any employee challenges the fairness of the redundancy, the first thing that their solicitor is going to ask for, the first thing a tribunal judge will ask for, is let's see a business case. When was it created? They want to see that you've done this business case before you started any process. And obviously we touch on alternative things that we've looked at, as we mentioned at the top of the call, but also in that business case, we would enter things in like, facts and figures, really, profits, loss, whatever the right reason. That business case could be based on an economic, which is quite obvious. Most of the time it is. It's, need to save some money. Technical, as we touched on right at the start, it might be a change in software and machinery, and we need to make, or it could be organizational, so certain roles are no longer needed and we're amalgamating different roles together, etc. So
yeah, you've got to sorry, I've just thought, because this also fits in with our other business that we work with, succession planning. So if you're being acquired, the acquirer, if they're intending to make people redundant, they've got to go through this process. They're intending to get rid of some duplicate staff or whatever. They've got to go through the proper process, and they've got to do a proper plan for it.
Absolutely, yeah. So that business case is the first stage. Now, I'm not going to go too much into collective consultations. That's when we're talking about when there's 20 or more people being made redundant, not 20 or more within a pool, but actual people who are leaving the business. So there's a lot more stringent rules around how long these processes need to last, right to representation through electing reps, etc. And it's even when you're dealing with more than 100 redundancies, there's further rules around that. But look, we don't want to get too involved in that side, because it's probably unlikely that it's going to
fingers crossed. If you're having to do this, you're getting rid of only less than 20. And is that, just to be clear, it's each time? So you could be doing a route that if your business cases you need to reduce by 10, but then you could be doing another case, say in 9 months' time, that may be another 11, but they're two separate events.
Two separate. Now, the only thing that could potentially link that is a 90-day period. So if you just made 15 people redundant, and then 60 days later you're going to make another 10, then it's too close. What you'd have to still follow the proper consultation, the minimum consultation periods for certainly for the second lot of redundancies. And if it's found that you knew that there were going to probably be another host of redundancies, you probably get done for the first lot as well. So there is some rules around that. So.
And to be honest, from a sorry, I'm going blank today. So from a so that you don't get the people upset, a demotivation, I said. So if you don't, from a demotivation perspective, it's better to do it large and quickly rather than eke it out, because people then, if you're in a business that is constantly, and in the late 90s, I know some of you out there will been at school or perhaps weren't even working at this point, but in the late 90s, when there was quite a lot of stuff, a lot of redundancies going on, you could feel like that was all that was happening. Every year is redundancies in your business. So it's doing it done and then moving forward. So sometimes it's better to go deeper, but get it out of the way.
I would agree with that, because, like you say, no one wants to, as an employee, you want that job security. And if there's redundancies every quarter, you're thinking, well, shall I look for another job where I'm going to get that security? And you can end up losing people you don't want to lose.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why one of the businesses that I left was because it was just, I was the one contributing to making the business cases, and that's very depressing, continually having to go through who's going to be made redundant or not. It's not a fun environment to be working in.
Certainly not.
But at least I also knew that I wasn't being made redundant because I was doing the list. But it's still not very good for your colleagues. And it's not nice.
No, so that's why I ideally do it in one fell swoop. But obviously, some situations might not be. You can't avoid that. But the process in a nutshell is, if we're dealing with making less than 20 staff redundant, we can do individual consultation effectively. So what that means is, you've got your business case. We can meet with the staff as a whole, or you might want to meet with them one-to-one who are within that pool of staff that are having to be reduced or removed completely. You will make them aware that they're at risk of redundancy and give them a basic flavour of why, what the business case is. You don't need to provide the business case, because often it's got quite a lot of sensitive information in there, financial, etc. But you can have that initial informal meeting, make them aware they're at risk, give them a reason, give them a letter which invites them to a formal consultation meeting. So then we wait a few days. You don't want to do it the day afterwards. You've got to give a little bit of time for people for it to sink in, because that first consultation meeting is for them to think of any suggestions to avoid redundancies. Now, often you've already looked at them and you've already said it's not feasible. It's part of your business case. You probably touched on it. But once every blue moon, someone does come up with a potential idea that could avoid redundancies. So the forum is there so that they can propose those suggestions. If there's a group of people, it's not just a single post, then what you have to do then is put a scoring criteria, which we've touched on previously. So how do we know which one out of that team of, say, 5, which one or which 2 are going to be made redundant? So we've got to get some agreement during that meeting, and you can set this criteria as a business. You know what's important for that particular role. You might want to use some obvious objective ones like length of service can play a part of that. Disciplinary record. We're looking at absence record. Don't include disciplinary, disability-related absences, of course. So we can get those kind of objective ones, but there might be things like qualifications. There might be targets, revenue. How their performance can be, and ideally, you maybe have a couple of managers or a couple of senior people scoring them. So then there's less argument for bias if one person says, well, that manager's obviously friends with that person,
Yeah, you've got to have multiple people on it, definitely.
Yeah. So that we get that agreement on what the criteria is at that risk meeting. You can then go away and score each person. You're only then going to meet with the ones who fall within those the redundancy places. So you don't need to meet with every single one of that staff members. You just meet with if it's just one person who's going to be made redundant, you meet with the person who's finished last on that scoring criteria. If it's two people, we'll meet with those two. What you want to do there is just get confirmation that they understand the scores, how it's scored, and that they're happy with that. The main thing is obviously that we're not giving someone a higher score. Let's just say they've got the same absence rate as someone else, but they've scored lower for some reason. That's going to obviously throw up some questions. The scoring's got to be in line with other people's score. That's why you set the criteria and the bandings. But the reason why you meet with those individuals is just so that they got any option. They've got a possibility if they're unhappy with how we've scored to raise that.
Or if a mistake's been made, when you're dealing with lots of people, sometimes there is an accidental mistake in somebody's record. So
yeah. And look, it might be that actually there was a mistake, or we decided, it was a little bit harsh on that particular score. Let's increase their score, and that might change the league table. So maybe then we have to meet with someone else who's now been brought into that redundancy position. However, they may argue their scores back out of it again. So it's hard. So once you've met with the people who are at risk and they still remain in those places, we can set up a final meeting with those individuals, but we can also let the other individuals know that they're no longer at risk of redundancy. So for everyone else, they're not going to actually be. They've only really had that first initial at-risk meeting and a formal consultation meeting. A few days later, they're not going to have any other further meetings. There's no requirement for that. It's just the people who will finish the lowest on the scoring that will meet with them on one last chance for them to bring anyone forward. They have the right to be represented in that meeting as well, because ultimately they're going to potentially be given their notice then. So that's effectively how the process goes. It's 3 stages. You have that initial informing, the consultation and the scoring in the middle, and then the outcome for those who are being. So it does sound more on the simple side, but often each case is it's very much dependent on case-by-case basis, and each individual is slightly different. It's even something like if you meet people no longer working from the office and working from home, that is a redundancy because the work stopped in the office. Maybe people don't have ability to work from home. Maybe the internet connection is not great. Maybe they've got people around. It's not feasible. So they could argue it's not a reasonable alternative. So I'm going to ask for redundancy pay. So there's loads of different things to consider during that process. We obviously can't go into too much detail on that, but I hope it gives you a good idea.
Our time is up.
All done.
Hopefully not forever. So no, that was great. Really got some really good detail there, Bryn. So thank you so much for that. So as I mentioned at the time, I promised that I would give you the contact. So if you do want to talk about the options and make sure that you are following a process, or discuss whether you should or shouldn't follow a process, do feel free to contact myself, or you can contact Bryn's colleague Owen, which is Owen Clark at peninsula-uk.com. Do mention that you watched the Business Boardcast and you're going to referral, because he's known us for a long time, and it'll be the platinum service by saying that. So thank you so much, Bryn. That was really useful. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So next week we have our guest Stuart from Clark's Legal, who is going to be talking about the different trust options that can be set up with management buyouts. So that's increasingly getting popular. So we're going to be talking about the legal process and some of the tax perks as well of doing that and why you should do them. But for now, I hope you all have it's difficult to say about a happy weekend because it's going to be probably quite a somber weekend for a lot of people. But I hope for everybody's weekend goes well, and I'll see you all next Friday. Cheerio.